thank you very much for this very kind introduction and also for inviting me here. It has been a long conference for you and probably you are quite exhausted. I hope it also has been interesting and intellectually stimulating. And being a last person on the last day, I tried to keep this relatively simple. What I'm going to present here is not a research paper, but very kind of academic essay. And I start with explaining my personal viewpoint. For a long time, I have had a kind of double identity. On the one hand, I have been a poet and a writer, much inspired by nature. And I also have had a personal connection with different wild animals due to my father, who is a wildlife filmmaker. On the other hand, I'm also an academic scholar, a mixed breed between biologists specializing on animal ecology and a semiotician studying textual interpretations of environment. And this double identity has led me to inquire human experience of the environment and how it can be depicted in the written text. What are relations between human verbal culture and sign activities of other species, and how our cultural understandings influence the natural environment? So these are few bases from which my talk departures. And to keep this double identity in my presentation, I will also show you an old ethnographic nature documentary as a background of my talk. The title of this film is Life Around You, and it is about an old man, a bird watcher, who collects seaweed and uses these to make nest boxes for birds. The film was produced in 1995 by my father, using the technical possibilities available at that time. And this film has really bad video quality. But showing this has been my deliberate choice here for two reasons. First, to have some animals in the room, and second, to distort a bit this kind of standardized academic conversation format, and to bring your attention to the properties of communicative medium that we're using when expressing our thoughts, that is an essential aspect of my talk. So if you are too exhausted from previous talks, you can just watch the film. I do not mind. But now let me try to start this. As I mentioned, my academic background is in semiotics, more especially in biosemiotics. And for most people in humanities, at least in Europe, the word semiotics associates with structuralist tradition, with the semiology of Ferdinand de Saussure, Prague linguistic circle, culture criticism of Roland Barthes, and other scholars of a similar line. But biosemiotics relates to different tradition of thought, that inside semiotics has become more and more eminent in recent decades. This tradition proceeds, for instance, from the works of Baltic German biologist Jakob von Uexküll, who has described an animal and a part of the environment it lives in as mutually coupled through meaning relations. Nature, in Uexküll's view, consists of different animal species that are meaningfully interconnected by perception and action. Other relevant influence to biosemiotics comes from the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce and his followers. The central concept for this tradition is a sign, and especially its dynamical aspect, semiosis. That is the most general way a mediated relation or a mediated change To pick one among many definitions given by Peirce, a sign is something which stands to somebody for something in some respect or capacity. And differently from European tradition, Peirce's semiotics and biosemiotics are capable of dealing with sign relations in nature and discussing culture-nature relations with an emphasis of their connectedness. So biosemiotics has studied various processes in living systems as meaning-based, from the transmission of genetic information on the molecular level up to the communication in animals. And for the humanities, the emergence of biosemiotics that widens the sphere of semiotic processes or communicative processes to embrace all living organisms on Earth probably means that human cultural activities cannot be described as an island in the vast ocean of unknown, but rather that culture should be considered as being surrounded by a multitude of other semiotic systems, some partly accessible, some that are different from ours. And in accordance to my viewpoint, I also tried to observe sustainability, education, and knowledge from a semiotic perspective. An essential principle of sustainable development has been stated to keep human technological development, use of resources, social and knowledge processes within the carrying capacity of the biosphere. But here we may note, however, the following paradox. Differently from technological and social development, the human sign processes, or semiosis, appear to grow exponentially and without any borders. If our abilities for physical and technological growth are in principle limited by the carrying capacity of the planet, there does not seem to be any similar restriction for a growth of human semiosis or knowledge. And I use the term semiosis here as a kind of umbrella term to cover different types of sign processes: perception, cognition, communication, knowledge, naming, and so on. Thus, it becomes a reasonable to ask that can ever-growing knowledge support the sustainable development? Can the growth of knowledge and sustainability fit together at all? On one hand, we may take a position that the growth of human semiosis is a very positive thing. Our awareness grows. We will get more information about natural processes and are better capable of predicting them, influencing them, and perhaps also working out better strategies in living together with nature. But the problem is that human semiotic processes are not really separated from the physical world, but need material resources, and they also shape our behavior, our behavioral activities towards the environment. And I can make here reference back to the works of Jakob von Uexküll, who has described the living subject and the environment it lives in as mutually coupled through the cycle of perception and action. Knowledge about the nature is just one part of this cyclical process, and it's quite easy to find real-life arguments for supporting this. For instance, what will you do if your USB stick or memory card runs full? Quite probably you will go and buy another one, and a bigger one. So knowledge, information, it needs also material carrier, material basis. Professor Kalevi Kull and we have together written papers when we have argued that human ability to use symbolic sign systems for accumulating and conveying knowledge are deeply related with the environmental degradation that we have. This is first because humans perceive environment based on their cultural modeling and symbolic interpretation, and later in the action, they imprint their semiotic character onto other living organisms and onto physical matter, to the environment. We call such a process a semiotization of nature, where a human symbolic character is printed to the environmental structures. A good example of this and its effects on the environment is mapping and map usage. A map represents an actual landscape approximately. Smooth traditions in the wild are represented by straight lines. A diversity of biological communities is reduced to a few symbols. Some environmental properties of the landscapes are represented, others are ignored. And later, when the same map is used by humans as a guide for practical activities within the landscape, the map users tend to imprint the distinctions and forms used in the map onto a real landscape. And this map-based modeling cycle is at work in various human activities, from forestry to real estate development to military strategy and action. So the very question that I want to raise here is, to what extent our cultural discourses, also when we are talking about sustainability, or even when I am reading my presentation here, have really a connection to the environment itself? To what extent and how our discourse is related to the objects under the observation? Or to put this in other words, to what extent the discourse that we are using is itself sustainable? Well, it may have a connection in the referential plane, in the way that the words that we are using make reference to environmental objects or processes. But this is a relatively weak connection. We may ask also about other possible components of communication. For instance, to what extent our discourse and our practices are contextualized by natural environment in the way that the content of our communication becomes constrained or motivated by the environment itself? Or to what extent the environment participates in our discourse as a subject or as an agency? To what extent our communication codes and cultural conventions relate to codes and habits used by other living creatures in the environment? This old man in the movie, who collects wood from the seashore and uses this to make nesting boxes for birds, is probably connected to environment in many different levels. He knows the life around him, knows different bird species, and this is not just an abstract knowledge learned by book. He knows birds' nesting habits and can construct the nesting box suitable for any particular species. He hangs the nesting boxes to trees facing southeast so that they would warm up early in the morning, and birds prefer these nesting boxes. They are willing to inhabit these. Birds relate to his activities and efforts by living near his household, by eating the food that he provides during the winter, and by picking reed from his roof to build their nests. So the knowledge of this man is connected to the environment in many different ways. We may say even that he belongs to the discourse of the birds, inasmuch as birds belong to his understanding and his worldview. Now, let me shift the gear here and continue by using some insights from my biological studies. One of my research objects in biology has been mimicry, as a deceptive similarity between the members of several different species. In biological mimicry, one species can resemble the second one to deceive the third species. For instance, a hoverfly can resemble a wasp to deceive a flycatcher or some other insectivorous bird. But there are also mimicry systems where a large number of mimetic species share the same appearance, as for instance, bees, bumblebees, and wasps share a similar warning coloration, and such color code may be known to a large number of different bird species, tits, flycatchers, swallows, warblers, to form a kind of natural convention. Thus, we have certain understanding, a regulation, or even a discourse that is shared by many species of a given ecological community. Another suitable example of such natural convention would be the phenomenon known as biophony. Namely, it appears that when birds are singing in the natural environment, arrangement of their songs is not occasional, but they match the rhythms and intervals of their vocalizations to other species, so that the whole chorus in the spring forest does not sound cacophonic, but really has a music-like qualities. Here again, certain convention between many species is established, where knowledge is not limited to one species, but rather spreads and is maintained by many species in biological community. Such biologically shared knowledge can be called ecological codes, and I have tried in my earlier works to give a systematic description of these. For instance, ecological codes appear to be distributed and open. They involve different species with different physiologies who do not have full perception of a code, but who carry rather a partial variation of this convention. An ecological code is also local, as it incorporates the consistencies, constraints, and habits existing in the particular ecological community. And an ecological code uses different types of memories. It can be partially fixed in the physical regularity, partially in genetic memory of one species, and partially in the cultural memory of another species, a human, for instance. So I propose that also human semiotic activities and cultural codes can be reinterpreted in relation to these ecological conventions by asking to what extent human knowledge and activities remain connected to ecological codes and are part of these broader ecologies of knowledge. We can rephrase this thought and express it in the simple language by saying that human knowledge is sustainable if human action makes sense to other inhabitants of the biosphere. And this is an important point that I want to stress. Communicative relations are in principle dialogic and bidirectional. If we search, for instance, a contact with a local community, it is, of course, important that we are able to interpret the language, cultural habits, and social behavior of these local people. But it's also important that we act and live in the way that our actions and our activities could become objects of interpretations for this other party. And the same principle is valid, probably, in our relations to the environment and to other living beings. A critical question then becomes, to what extent our discourses and activities provide ground for other animals to interpret our involvement in different ways? To what extent our being provides the semiotic anchoring points in the subjective spheres or umwelts of other living creatures to organize their behavior and their living activities? If such mutual connection is established, other living creatures also start to address humans by their utterances. They may become source of inspiration and value judgments for humans. And clearly, the doings of this old man on the screen again provide a positive example of such process and contact. In this point, you may become critical and say something like, well, this is a nice romantic talk, But what, if any, practical value or applicability may such an approach give to us? And I'm about to address this as well. Namely, there appear to be methods in semiotics to analyze to what extent our semiotic activities and discourses have potential to be in contact with environmental processes. Probably the most obstructive to sustainable development are highly abstract and self-enclosed knowledge systems that tend to forget their history, their context, and their connection to their original background. Such purely formal and rule-based discourses tend to spread themselves aggressively to the surrounding intellectual sphere and have effect on surrounding social and physical environments. There are probably different tools and approaches that can be used to analyze text and discourses from this aspect, but one very simple option that I would like to provide here derives from the works of American philosopher Charles Peirce. He has created a very complex sign typology that, among other things, distinguishes three basic types of signs as icons, indexes, and symbols. In symbols, which are signs mostly characteristic to human linguistic communication, the sign relation is based on some sort of habit or convention. A symbolic sign would be, for example, a national anthem or a flag signifying a particular country or nation. In addition to symbolic signs, Peirce speaks about icons, where a relation between the sign and the object is based on resemblance, and about indexes, where a relation is physical or causal. In icons, the similarity between the sign and its object, for instance, between the color red and the blood that it signifies. In index, the relation exists because of a physical relation or causation. For example, a higher value in the thermometer signifying a warmer temperature. We can see that in the case of icons and indexes, there are possibility for factual or causal relationships between the signs and things present in the environment to emerge. According to Peircean semiotics, or a view derived from this, human cultural artifacts can be immediately related to the environment if they include iconical or indexical aspects. Examples of such sign relations in human language are, for instance, metaphors, onomatopoetic words, or deictic words. And there are probably more possibilities for iconic and indexical relations in sentence structure and in narrative level. We can even think of natural environment inspiring us to create a piece of nature essay or the poetry as a certain type of iconic sign activity. On the other side, it has also been assumed in biosemiotics that human symbolic and language-based knowledge is not accessible to other species, but resemblance-based icons and relation-based indexes could be. Therefore, if we aim to address the question of the sustainability of semiosis or human cultural text, we should consider that what is the balance of iconic, indexical, and symbolic aspects in human knowledge and cultural discourse, or even more, how iconic, indexical, and symbolic aspects relate to each other or sustain each other. In simple language and in focusing really text, different types of text, we can express these three Peircean categories as follows. Iconic sign relations would be present in qualitative or emotional aspects of text or discourse. What is its immediate perception? How the text feels? What an emotional impact does it make to us? Indexical sign relations would be present in applicability of the text or the discourse, or its real-life connection. how it derives from a given situation, what is its possible use in this given context. And symbolic aspect would be present in symbolic or cultural value of the text or the discourse. What is its history? Why it's important? And if a human cultural text aims towards sustainability, if it wants to be sustainable, then I claim that all these three aspects should be present and should be well interconnected. Text needs to be aesthetic, it needs to be relevant, and it needs to have value. And all these three in regard to the surrounding environment. Then the text or a discourse has a potential to be sustainable. Now I'm coming to the conclusion of my talk. My academic peer, biosemantician Professor Kalevi Kull, has made a strong statement that in order to be sustainable, knowledge should be incomplete and culture should be willing to forget. Thus, ever-growing knowledge and sustainability in principle do not fit together. And I agree with this position, especially if we consider culture to be just a symbolic culture, a linguistic and self-conscious culture. If we emphasize, however, also other aspects in human cultural discourses where iconic and indexical sign relations prevail, there an alternative explanation and solution is also possible. Culture can be sustainable if its text, discourses, and artifacts are connected to the living environmental processes in different levels and through different aspects of communication. Or to express this thought from the other viewpoint, sustainability should not be considered just as a question of human culture and society, but it should be treated in regard to wider ecosystem. We can make a claim that sustainability is actually an ecosystemic property related to such ecological measures as persistence, diversity, and resilience. And in general, natural ecosystems are very well capable of sustaining themselves. And probably this is not a new idea, but what I want to point out here is that it should be applied to our cultural practices and our texts that we are using as well. The question therefore becomes that to what extent human cultural discourses have lost their connection to natural ecosystems and have lost their capacity for sustaining themselves, and what would be our possibilities for restoring this connection. I may need some technical help here. So, to conclude my talk, I would like to finish this with a short summary what I have spoken so far, especially if you got drifted away by the video on the screen. I first took a biosemiotic viewpoint to discuss sign relations or semiosis between culture and nature. I posed the question, what are environmental effects of human semiosis? How our knowledge influences environment through our action? And can ever-growing knowledge support the sustainable development? I tried to demonstrate that there are cultural texts and discourses with different relations to the environment and different potential for sustainability. I discussed sign processes and conventions outside of human culture under the concept of ecological codes as a background in relation to which human semiosis should be analyzed. And I brought out examples of mimicry and biophony here. And I argued that there are some methods in semiotics, for instance, Bayesian sign analysis, but there are others as well, that can be used to describe potential of discourses, text, and cultures to arrange environmental relations. And there are also some practical studies, applied studies, done using this kind of approach. These are published in these journals, as you can see. And to try to capture the main ideas, very basic points of my talk, now coming backwards from the end to the beginning, I argued for the idea that sustainability should not be considered as a property of human culture and society, but with a reference of the entire ecosystem. In this context, I viewed human culture and knowledge sustainable if they are connected to the ecological code. That is, if human actions make sense to other inhabitants of the ecosystem as well. And third, I argued that text or discourse has a potential to be sustainable if it has different types of communicative relations to the environment. For instance, if the aesthetic aspects, relevance or relation to the environment and value present in this text are all there in regard or in relation to the surrounding environments. So this was a short overview that I wanted to share with you here, and thank you.
Thank you, Timo, for another view on what knowledge is and what is meaningful, how can we interpret the world around us. Any questions or comments? Yes.
Evelyn, thank you for this. It was very interesting. I think it was the most interesting speech we've had so far. And I have a question regarding to your own texts. Have you analyzed what you are writing, these two which you were referring now? The last ones, one was in Estonia and this in Academia, and the green letter is probably the same text. Do you think it is sustainable?
Okay. You mean these texts that were analyzed in this? Yeah, I think so. I think that these texts are actually two essays by Fred Jussi, who is very well-known and eminent Estonian nature writer. And I think these are good examples of the sustainable text. And for me, they work especially well because they have a kind of a very multi-layered structure that you can read them on the surface level, and there is some sort of ecological information and guidance towards the environment and nature. But on the other hand, there is also a kind of deep structure, deep connections between, for instance, the presence and the absence of different elements in natural environment and in human households. And then this kind of tension, it brings up certain type of thinking or certain type of perception about the environment.
It's not okay. I was thinking about your own text, these academic texts you were presenting, like as the grounds to your presentation here. Is it possible that academic text is sustainable?
Okay. That's a very good question, how they respond usually when they cannot answer. But well, in general, the viewpoint that I want to stress here is that you need to have like different levels or different levels of thinking, different levels of attention, working in parallel and working in connection. And so probably academic discourse in its own, it may have a tendency to become too closed and too self-contained. But on the other hand, also, it may be that just very practically oriented approach on its own gets lost somehow. So for me, the solution would be to have this kind of exchange and interconnection between different levels of thinking, to have very practical and also kind of perhaps emotionally based approach to nature, and to have perhaps more theoretical thinking in parallel, and to look how these two can support each other and how they work together.
Any other questions? Yes, Leon?
Thank you. It's very interesting and stimulating, but I think I disagree with you on a lot of points. And maybe that's because I'm not understanding quite what you're saying. But it seems to me that you might be endowing non-human creatures with far too much ability to conceptualize here. This idea that human actions make sense to the other inhabitants of the ecosystem seems a very strange thing to say. If I could illustrate that. We know that bees and other pollinating insects are in trouble. Good-hearted people are researching the reasons for this and trying to make things better. Yeah? But I doubt that the site or even the report of someone searching research papers online to find out evidence for reasons for hive colony collapses, the decline of ecosystems and stuff. I doubt if the process of research will ever make sense to any non-human animal. I don't think it even makes sense to most human animals when people see somebody researching. Does my criticism or question make sense to you? Because I think there's too much. Now there is a slight second part to this, with the idea that non-human animals somehow don't understand language. I think that too is highly questionable, and I think anyone who has a dog will know that. I mean, my dog knows very well what the word biscuit means. So, there's two parts to that. I don't think they have conceptual sense, and yet some animals do respond interestingly to language. But I'd welcome your thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Well, I definitely do not want to make the claim that bees or other animals would be able to read and interpret academic papers. So that's not the case. But on the other hand, I mean, if you look how bees orient in the environment, or from where this trouble actually becomes, then quite often it has to do with their abilities to perceive environment, to recognize things in the environment, to memorize, to orient, which in a sense also semiotic capacities that are different than our conceptual thinking. But we also orient in the environment. We also perhaps place a beehive somewhere, taking into account what is the surrounding fields there. So there is some sort of overlap. I'm not saying that we could equalize human use of science and human use of discourses and animal use of discourses. or animal sign use. But it seems to me that one root of this problem of sustainability is that this overlap, this connection point, is too fragile. It's not there anymore. And also probably for us humans, one problem is to be thinking conceptually, to use abstract categories, abstract discourses, and not being in contact, for instance, also other semiotic modalities inside ourselves. I mean, how we relate spatially with the environment, what kind of perceptions there are, what we perceive unconsciously as positive or that we like somehow. So this was a point that I wanted to put forward, more or less. I'm not sure, did I answer to you, but I tried at least. Yeah.
Not quite.
Are there any? Then I just continue from there. Then perhaps just to put it in some other terms, this discussion. You said that our actions are sustainable if the community around us, ecosystem around us, recognizes what we are doing. So if I take a simple case of waste or pollution, then an ecologist would say that the problem emerges from not having consumers of this material in an ecosystem. Is that the same when you say that there are no living beings recognizing this material as a food source, for example?
In the sense, yes. I mean, they are interconnected, because for being able to use something as a food source, you need to recognize this. Consequently, you need to have access to this. You need to be able to relate somehow to human activities, human households, whatever. And this is really the question that how much we, in our activities, our being, how much we give a kind of ground for interpretation, ground for recognition to other living creatures, so that they can come and eat our trash, for instance.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And this is in a sense interesting that it's in the same time it's semiotic, it's communicational, and it can be very material. Or kind of interrelation between them.
And it makes actually, for example, hunting simply easily understandable, sustainable action in terms that animals can recognize that hunter is coming. And this is a meaningful action for them. If a scientist is going to out to the field, collect the bees to study what is the problem, it is a meaningful action for bees. Just get the hell away. You know? I may be too much simplifying what you're saying. Arjen.
Well, thank you for indeed a very interesting presentation that in some ways connects with the first talk this morning, I think. This relational, dialogical way of connecting with place, and to also connect with the, I would say, the non-human and maybe even the more than human world. But what I'm looking for, and maybe you can reflect on this, is what does your paper or your talk imply for the way we organize teaching, learning, and create opportunities for, say, young people to have this more relational quality in their learning? Do you have any ideas for this? Is there a pedagogical well, message is maybe not the right word, but are there pedagogical implications of this?
Okay. Well, my background is really not in pedagogy, so I'm in the strange waters here in this sense. And this is what I'm saying. This is not really nothing new for pedagogy, but probably one emphasis that this kind of approach does is that learning process is very much relational. It's very much context-based and based on specific being in a specific environment. And perhaps what I can do here is just to provide some sort of support from cultural theory or cultural understanding to this contextualized thinking. Yes.
It's a good call to think about it and take this task on us, really. So thank you, Timo, very much for coming and having the interesting talk, something to enjoy for you.